Welcome to Jeremy Pryor's podcast, or what I like to call Jeremy Pryor Unfiltered. I'm his daughter and producer, Kelsey Gall, and we are excited to bring you seasons of content all the way from Tolkien to theology, from business to family. If you like to contemplate deep philosophical ideas across a wide range of topics, you've come to the right place. Make sure you give us a follow so you don't miss out on future episodes.
Awesome, guys. I am back with my partner in crime, Ryan Emge. Ryan, thanks for being with me today.
Great to be here.
Yeah, man. So this is kind of last minute. I was chatting with Ryan via social media this morning. We were like, I really wanted to have a conversation about borders, a kind of a quick conversation, because it's always being framed in a way that I wish it were framed differently. And so I kind of tried to write out some of my thoughts and just kept thinking about it and thought it would be fun to tease this out. So let me read a few of these thoughts. I don't have an entire essay written about this, but I was doing some posts on social media. So the original post, I'll kind of read a few things I said, and I kind of want to throw out a few comments and then get Ryan's thoughts. So the most underrated reason for borders is so that onlookers can gain wisdom. Borders show us where bad ideas end and good ideas begin. Borders between houses, families, businesses, and countries help the wise observe the outcome of competing ideas and act accordingly. That's kind of the framing I really like, that we need to be able to see the outcome of ideas. And I said, think of borders as the boundaries between different stages, where we get to watch what ideas lead to more life or more misery. So if you thought about every border, every family, every business, every state, every country, and what you're really seeing is the ideas, kind of what kind of fruit is generated by the ideas that are being adopted inside of those borders. And that's a very, very valuable way of perceiving it. And then I wanted to take on kind of what I felt like would probably be people's most natural framing, at least those who are really into more open borders. And so I wrote here, we tend to think our biggest problem is a lack of resources, that by improving the distribution of resources, we will solve our deepest problems, and that borders impede that process. Yes, that's a problem, but we have a much bigger problem. We lack wisdom. We must preserve borders for that reason. We need to watch how ideas play out over generations. America's founding fathers were able to study hundreds of failed case studies when drafting a new system of government. We can be pro-immigration out of compassion for those suffering and be pro-borders so that our children and our grandchildren can see, learn, and choose paths that lead to life. So this is all by way of trying to understand how important the wisdom being gained by borders, that's actually the biggest problem. And I think a lot of people don't see that we have a wisdom problem. We don't know how to govern ourselves. And so when you look at a family that's breaking down or a city that's breaking down, the first question shouldn't be a knee-jerk reaction to how can we, either flood resources into that broken system, or how can we absorb all the brokenness of that system. We first have to pause and ask, what is broken about that system? When you're walking down the street and you see a house that's really well ordered, where the children are flourishing and educated and loving their parents, and the marriage is full of life and love, and then the next house you go to, there's just chaos everywhere, and your first question shouldn't be, okay, we need to flood resources. We need to take resources away from this flourishing family and dump them in, because the only problem that exists is a lack of resources. This flourishing family over here, they are clearly stealing resources from this poor family over here. No. First, what are the ideas that are different? And maybe that's even a more fundamental. So that's how I always think about borders primarily. And I get really nervous when people go straight to resources. But yeah, what does that stir up for you, Ryan?
The resources idea seems to be just a distraction. I think the root of the conversation, the root problem is, borders versus what? If we don't have borders, what seems to be the opposing view of having these boundaries and borders is diversity. So it seems to me that there's a war between Diversity is our strength. Like we hear that all the
Right.
time, right?
Yes.
Diversity is like one of the highest moral values in America now. It's like on repeat. If you say you're for diversity, you're a good moral person. And I think that's what's being positioned against having borders, not just a physical border, but you can kind of see that diversity really just ends up playing out as anything goes, right? It's not just anyone can come over the border without any filter, but it's like any ideas, any beliefs.
Yes.
It doesn't matter what you believe. We see this practically like in business. It's like they're constantly pushing diversity in business at the expense of, in my opinion, quality or competency. We used to have a value system in America that was pretty much everyone agreed with, that if you had to be competent in order to raise the hierarchy in a business.
Right.
Now it's more about, hey, do we have enough diversity in our staff here? And how do we inject diversity? And so what it essentially does is it causes disunity. It displaces people. It puts people in an isolated kind of individualistic state. They don't know who their people are. There's no one to lean back on. We don't know who's got our back, and it kind of creates chaos.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking too that I think that this conversation around diversity, it's not necessarily a zero-sum game. I think that part of what we can understand is that there are different value sets, right? What's weird is that the value for diversity has somehow eclipsed, this is very unusual historically, the value for competence. And so if your job is to provide a really good product or service for a customer, then it's strange to value something like diversity over competence, because that's core to why you exist. I think diversity as a value is a fine value. I think that the idea that a lot of people are concerned about, especially living in a melting pot like America, is that if you look around and you only see one race, or you only see one set of ideas, or whatever, however you're defining diversity, then sometimes what occurs is groupthink, or sometimes what occurs is suspicion of the stranger. I mean, in the order of what you want to experience, one of the reasons why I love taking my kids overseas, and I love it when they're in a culture where they're in a minority. I think that there's all kinds of that's a value I have. But when it comes to like where that fits in the hierarchy, it's just we've I think because there's a real suspicion of competence, and I think really comes from this idea that people just don't believe that it's actually competence. It's not, they don't actually believe it's ideas. People that are adopting, in a disciplined way, better ideas that's creating value. They actually think value just sort of appears out of midair, and anytime somebody else has some more value, there's something nefarious going on. And so these other values, because they've so deeply diminished the value for competence, with the understanding of that ideas matter, that ideas have consequences, that we need to be really careful about, the way that we're thinking about reality and whether or not we're gaining wisdom, because all of those things are under suspicion now. Those values are just getting destroyed, and now these very novel values that, like I said, they're important in their own right to some degree, they're becoming ascendant.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with diversity in the sense of, let's hear the opposing side. Like, I definitely don't want to be part of groupthink. It's always more fun too to have people that have different ideas, but I think what this diversity value as being positioned as like one of the highest moral values in America these days, it's really just undermining our culture. It's undermining, I'd say, the fabric of American culture, and even church culture. And I think we've got to, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on this, is like, we've got to have boundaries. We have to have spaces that we have control over, right? That we're kind of autonomous, so that the fruit that's produced out of it can be a sign to others, like, hey, these values are actually good. It's just like with the abortion debate. I would love to have a federal ban on abortion, but there's something about allowing liberal blue states to keep their abortion and red states ban it, so that we can see in a generation, maybe it's 10 years, 20 years, we can see the fruit of those two different cultures.
That's right.
And then people can judge. And I actually believe there's going to be a massive harvest in the kingdom when people are able to contrast these two. And I also think that's why people are so big on federal politics, especially leftist, is because they're not allowing to see the distinguishment between the two ideas. They're forcing their ideas top down.
That's right.
And that's why I was saying, and to you in our chat earlier today, was that's why we should really focus on state politics. Like we should prioritize state over federal. Now we may have to get federal in our politics in order to protect state rights, right? There's that war going on between states' rights and federal rights, but I just think it's enormously powerful if we're able to have states that are more conservative, more Christian, and contrast them. And then, hey, let's have a debate then. It's really hard if everything's mixed together, and we can't see what's good and what's bad.
Yeah, that sort of original idea that the states are the laboratory for liberty, where we get to, I get to see what happens when you roll out universal health care in Massachusetts, to see if we want to adopt that in Kentucky. That's a really healthy thing. And I think that saying every experiment has to be experimented simultaneously on the entire nation because I have such a great idea and it sounds so compassionate is really dangerous. Like please experiment on your city, on your state. What's really bad, of course, is when you experiment on your city, your state, it's an absolute failure. And then you say, okay, well, what we really need is the whole country to adopt this. It's like, guys, like you have to constrain these experiments. And you have to be honest about the results. But I think that that's why I like to think about this border conversation as a fight to understand wisdom. So even when you're looking at a person, you look at, their body, their life, their mind, their relationships, it's okay to look at the fruit and say, okay, I'm going to pick mentors because they have control over the borders of the decisions that are being made in their sphere. And so to the degree that they have that control and that border is distinguishable, right? I can see that their ideas about how they choose to eat and how they choose to spend time with the Lord, like all of these things help me figure out who to go to when I lack wisdom, when I'm struggling with foolishness, and I struggle with foolishness all the time. And so I need to know where to go. And I think that the same, so you can then go out to the house. You're like, okay, whose household is flourishing? And every one of our households is a mixed bag. There's things in our houses that are, chaotic and broken. And there's things in our houses that are flourishing, hopefully, and strong and, abundant. And so, but to some degree, when something's broken in my house, but really works well in your house, I need you to have protected borders around your household so that I can go, hey, I think, people say, oh, go talk to Ryan about that. Like he's, his household's really, really thriving in that area. Great. Like so much of this is about just humility and saying, I have to admit I'm a foolish person. I'm an ignorant person. I desperately need wisdom. I know that's the thing that usually is causing me chaos in my life, but I do need really strong borders so that I know where to go, right? So that I can consult the right place. And so understanding borders in that fashion, I think, is a really different framing. And so when people are streaming into one country, they always say like, right now we're watching this mass exodus from Russia, and thank God there's a border there. So we all can look at that mass exodus, and so that Putin himself can look at that and say, maybe that wasn't such a good idea to call, to invade Ukraine and to he's learning right now. Now he might keep doubling down, but if he ever has a chance to learn that it's not a good idea to invade a country like that, it's only because the border between Ukraine and Russia exists and that now he's seeing the fruit of it. Like that's how everything works. That's how wisdom generally works. We have to have those borders, that clarity.
Need a blueprint to revise your family to be a multi-generational team on mission? The book Family Revision by Jeremy Pryor is the book that summarizes all the big picture ideas you hear on this podcast. Available on Amazon or familyteams.com.
Yeah, I'm curious your thoughts on, what the Bible, the scripture says. We see a lot of, cautions from God in the Old Testament. We see some cautions in the New Testament about protecting our culture, protecting the commandments, following the commandments. Don't let the pagans come in. Don't, watch out for the Canaanites, all that stuff.
Right.
And I think we see that theme in the New Testament as well. And there's also like a contrasting between how we treat believers and how we treat unbelievers.
Yes.
So those seem to be like boundaries or walls that we are to, let's say, guard and protect. Like, have you given that some thought with regard to this border conversation?
There's a really, I don't know if you've ever studied, I mean, Deuteronomy 32 is a crazy chapter. I've, it's hard to get to the bottom of Deuteronomy 32, but probably one of the most incredible parts of Deuteronomy 32. He says, he basically, God commands Moses to teach a song to all the Israelites so that it would reverberate in the ears of your offspring, he says, and that the offspring will basically prophetically tell the next generation what's about to happen. It's a fascinating song, but in verse 8 of Deuteronomy 32, it says, when the Most High, he's kind of telling the past, kind of a creation story, gave to the nations their inheritance. When he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. Now this is being debated, and like this is a deep theological question about what does it mean for God to fix the borders according to the sons of God. But one of the things that's is clear is that God wanted there to be different nations. He wanted the borders to be fixed, and he wanted there to be the opportunity for that nation to be able to choose, what God they're going to worship, right? And so he's like, Israel was given to Yahweh, but these other beings had much more access to these other nations, and so you have that description. So that's one thing I think that God really cares about this question about where the borders are between nations. Also, I think you have in the Torah this huge value for the immigrant or the sojourner who's coming through and kind of going through an assimilation process. Now, if you are an immigrant, and I think you can be very, very pro strong border and very pro immigration at the same time. I'm that way. I think
I agree.
Yeah, God actually put Israel in the center between Africa, Asia, and Europe for the sake of the sojourner, so that the world could pass through Israel, or in some cases join themselves to Israel. But one of the things you have to be careful, and that's why I posted this meme, about all the Californians, fleeing from California to Texas, and it says something like this big sign that says something like, "Remember, you're a refugee," not like I can't remember what the other word was.
Well, and now they're all going back to California after the Roe v. Wade overturning.
Oh, are they? Okay.
Yeah.
So it's just like
exodus back.
Yeah, basically the meme was like, if it didn't work in California, don't bring those ideas here and start to don't make Texas the next California. Again, there's whatever you think about those ideas, it's just really good that there is a Texas and a California. Like if you love California, then now I think that part of our challenge as believers is that we're supposed to be salt and light in a dark world. And I was just in Seattle last week, and I was, talking to them about family. And one of the things, one of the guys came up to me and he said, man, he said specifically, we are trying to stay in this very, very blue state in order to be salt and light here in this place. And I think that's just a different calling. And obviously I think kind of gets back to what you were saying earlier, to the extent that you are finding yourself at odds ideologically from, the governments that you're in. I think the answer is to sort of ratchet down to to whichever part you can influence. If that's a city, if that's a neighborhood, if that's just your family, make sure that, and then you kind of like move from, the flourishing fruitfulness of, yourself, your family, your neighborhood, then your city, and go as high as you can in your life, as you begin to extend that. But I think that's, that'll be something that will allow you to really make a difference, even in those really difficult places.
Yeah, I think I brought this up in another conversation with you, but there's a great book on called "Who Is My Neighbor" by Thomas Accord. I think it came out a couple years ago. It's an excellent book, but it's essentially making the historical case of how Christians viewed their moral responsibility. And so essentially it's like who is in your proximity, right? That's who you're most responsible for. You have to take care of your family. If you don't take care of your family, then you're worse than an unbeliever, right? Now we do care about the world. We care about people in China, but we can't care for them to the extent that we care for our immediate family or people that are in our church community, et cetera. And I think a lot of people get that flipped upside down. We've seen that with pastors in ministry where they're caring more about their congregation and they let their family go to the wayside, right? We see that a lot with men. They spend all their time in business and politics, like federal politics, but yet they're not having the important conversations in the discipleship in their home. So we've got to be very, very careful and mindful of how we balance our responsibility in the field. God's given us a field, and we need to steward that field appropriately. And I think we have to keep that framework in mind when we're stewarding it, because it helps us. We need to like bounce it up against this, like anything that comes our way, any invitation, anything that we're spending our time, bounce it up against that and say, hey, is this actually something in my control? Is this my highest priority or a low priority? You know?
Right. Yeah.
And that's been really helpful to me. And I think if a lot more people thought that way, they would invest their time a little differently.
Yeah. That principle really goes straight to the heart of the wisdom. You should only want your influence to extend to the boundaries of your personal wisdom. So, and how do you know that? Well, you know that in these sort of concentric circles. How are you governing yourself?
Yeah.
You know, how are you governing your household? How are you So if that's fruitful, then go, oh, wow, like I can serve more people now, because apparently, you know, I don't know everything, but there's something that's happening. There's something about my own maturity and my growth in wisdom that sounds like it could serve more people. And so then the concentric circles start to widen and widen and widen. And to your point, they're sort of like, because people are being taught that life is really a power game, and that really what you should do is, who cares about what you know or how wise you are? You know, all that matters is really what you want. And if you know what you want, even if it's very unwise and it's, you know, it's destroying your life, then you need to grab the largest amount of power you possibly can to inflict that want on even a larger and larger group of people. That's a very different idea. That doesn't serve people. That's a different view of the world. I think that the last thing I wanted to bring up too about, and this is kind of something I've wrestled with a lot in terms of like national borders, and our America's a really bizarre experiment, you know, because most nations were created ethnically, and the United States is really at its foundation a nation that's based on an idea, right? There were Native Americans here first, but I think we, those who immigrated to America, we came because almost exclusively and originally because there was an idea that wanted to be, you know, we wanted to generate, you know, there was a lot of like desire for religious freedom with the Pilgrims and, you know, various people. And obviously then you have the incredible tragedy of people being dragged here against their will through slavery. And so we've created this interesting, you know, what's been called a melting pot, you know, which is this, you know, what happens when there is this diversity. And so it's interesting. There's you know, on the Statue of Liberty, Emma Lazarus wrote this poem, you know, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. And this is, you know, probably one of the most pro immigration, you know, ideas, like right there, you know, in the harbor in New York, you have this statue basically saying, come here. To me, what's really, you know, this kind of like tease off like a whole nother conversation that, you know, we can't get into, but I think it's really important to like, you know, put a dot there. What does she mean yearning to be free? Because one of the things that I do think that makes Americans unique is the desire to create a free society. But I think we're now debating about the definition of freedom. And I think that the one main caveat to becoming an American citizen has to be that you desire freedom. And so there are people that want to immigrate to the United States that literally have a different vision. They don't want us to be a melting pot. They want to, you know, that they have a vision that life should be controlled by some other, whether it's, you know, various ideas around authoritarianism, any kind of like that idea, you know. So if you're a monarchist, you know, and you're like, I want to like enforce that. If you're, you know, a Marxist and we want to see, you know, a one party system like they have in China, or, you know, what often happens in Russia, or if you're if you're a Muslim who desires to see Islamic law be the rule of the day, and that if you get democratic control in any of these systems, we're always one election away from that becoming the that to me is the one main sort of litmus test for citizenship of our country. You have to want to be free, and you have to want to see that freedom be given to others. And I think that there's a whole conversation around theocrats as well, from I think the right that that have a vision that isn't in line with the American experiment. And so really having this conversation about what is American, what is America, it's hard when it's not an ethnic group that really sort of came from one family line, 1,000 years ago or 5,000 years ago, but it's people that have some kind of similar idea of what this experiment, as Abraham Lincoln described, is all about.
I would just add quickly, there is a common thread through early American settlers. Most of them are Christians.
Yeah.
So there was a Christian thread that was, I would say, the vast majority. So I don't think we were just a melting pot of all kinds of random ideas. I think there was diversity in thought, but I would say most of those ideas were outside, or the minority was outside of the standard Christian thought. So in a sense, we had, the first couple hundred years, we had kind of a Christian nationalism in a way, where our laws were heavily influenced by Christians and the scripture and the principles in the scripture. And it seems to be the case that we're, let's say, veering away from that, especially in the last 50 to 100 years. There's been a major shift.
Yeah. And that speaks to this debate about what the word free means. There's sort of a Judeo-Christian definition of freedom, which has a lot to do with, which includes the kind of constraint you have to create for yourself in order to be maximally free. So your good intentions actually are played out. That's deep in the scriptures, that we're enslaved to desires that need to be overcome. And that's the primary battleground on which we fight for freedom. And then there's sort of a secular version of that, which is the freedom to indulge whatever I want, like I said earlier, and then we fight, a zero-sum game for territory over what I want versus what you want, which is, which is a different definition.
I think we should be fighting for virtue. And I believe it was it Benjamin Franklin said that our country was designed for virtuous people.
Yes.
And I think that's where, as Christians, that's where our energy needs to be spent, is how do we turn the country into a virtuous people? It's not so much about, let's say, a diversity of opinion and all of this stuff, but how do we welcome people into the kingdom of God? How do we get people to agree with our religious ethics, right? There's a lot of people that are not even Christian, but they agree with almost everything that we agree with in the scripture. And so I think that's kind of the angle that we need to approach this, is to resurrect and have a revival with Christian virtue.
Yeah. Well, that's a great idea. So thank you, Ryan, for doing this. I think that's my big concern, is that let's be clear about where the borders are. Let's be clear about what the ideas that we're encouraging within each of these borders, ourselves, our families, our neighborhoods, our cities, our communities, our states. And then as that happens, let's not primarily think about borders as a way of protecting resources. Let's primarily think about them as experiments where we all get to watch the drama of these ideas played out across generations on various stages, so that our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren can learn wisdom. That's really what I hope happens. And that, I think, is why I'm really for making very clear where those borders are. So thanks for having this conversation. This is really helpful.
Last quick question. Would you say that men are responsible to maintain those borders?
Yeah, I would say that in each of these concentric circles, there has to be an understanding that what is the, first of all, just jurisdiction that we believe exists within those borders, and to whatever extent you begin to believe that, okay, this person is invading, this person's breaking into my house, and wants to like eat, drink, everything, as a man, do I have a unique responsibility, more than my wife, more than my children, to go and confront that man and say, you have to stay out of the borders of this house. You are not welcome. Absolutely. And I think that those concentric circles go all the way out.
Yeah. The reason I ask that is because if no one is given that responsibility, or no one's aware that there's a responsibility there, then it's like nobody has a responsibility. Or if it's shared, like it seems to me that it is men that need to put this on their radar, like protecting these different boundaries and walls within their family, within their communities, within their state, whatever. And be mindful of that and manage it, make sure it's safe, just like Boaz did in the book of Ruth. I think he's a great archetype of someone who protected that, took responsibility for it. So I just wanted to kind of wheel that in into something that's super practical.
Yeah.
Right?
And then he that in Ruth chapter 4, you see that he was with a group of elders protecting the boundaries of Bethlehem, their
That's
village.
Right.
And so, I do think you see that. I do think that's a really important principle. Awesome. Thanks, Ryan.
Yeah, it's great to talk this out with you.
Thank you for listening to Jeremy Pryor's podcast. Make sure you hit that follow button so you don't miss out on any future content. Follow Jeremy on Twitter and Instagram, as well as his Substack blog, all linked in the description. See you next time.